Okay, so a couple of points from the um, from Lewis Gordon's essay on Frederick Douglass as an existentialist. Um, the first is the tagline written by himself. That's a part of Douglass's 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. But that tagline, written by himself, is necessary in the context of the white denial of Black perspectives, of subjectivity, of humanity, because to say written by himself, right, is to express a point of view, which means that Douglass has a point of view. It's a subjectivity, a humanity, human being. Right? This is not a story about an object. This is a story told by a person, written by himself. Right. So there's a kind of a rejection of the objectification of his humanity, like turning him into an object, even by this sort of tagline written by himself. The white denial of Black perspective, subjectivity, or humanity that allows Coffee, the slave breaker. So there are two kind of important stories that are discussed in that essay by Douglass. The incident with Coffee, the slave breaker, and the incident with Miss Sophia Auld, his sort of mistress, the wife of the master, one of Douglass's master. And so in the Coffee situation, the white denial of Black perspectives, subjectivity, or humanity that allows Coffee, the slave breaker, to treat Douglass like an object requires Coffee to maintain a perspective of bad faith. Right. So this was a concept that you want to understand, at least in a multiple choice kind of framework from that essay. Bad faith, or continually lying to himself about his experience of the subjectivity and humanity of Douglass as a Black man. So the idea of bad faith is just like that. It's lying to yourself, but lying to yourself so much that you almost believe your own lie. Right? It's kind of sublimating or hiding what you're seeing. And obviously, Coffee looks at Douglass, another human being, and can see that he is another human being. But to treat him like an object, like a slave, requires sort of suppressing that basic human truth that is in his experience. And that's that bad faith, right? It's pushing that down to sort of like, no, you're just an object. Now, when Miss Sophia Auld teaches Douglass to read, Douglass talks about that in his writings, and Gordon talks about it too. Douglass sees this as Miss Auld's inability, at least at that moment, to maintain this bad faith lie that Douglass is not a human being with a perspective and a subjectivity, right? So she, you know, after spending some time with him, decides, oh, I'm going to teach you to read. That kind of breaks through this bad faith sort of lie that Douglass is not just a little boy, right? And not a human being. There's a little boy, and for a moment, she's able to kind of to see beyond the lie she's been telling to herself, that Douglass is not a human being with a perspective and a subjectivity, and she starts to teach him to read. But as you remember from the story, then she gets a lot of backlash from her husband, and then even sort of goes to greater extent to kind of maintain that lie, to suppress that reality, and is even more mean to him than anyone. When Douglass fights back against Coffee, the slave breaker, after a 2-hour-long physical battle, Douglass ultimately conquers Coffee. And Douglass talks about this in existential terms, in this kind of existential awakening or existential fall. Through this fight and defeating of Coffee, the slave breaker, Coffee's belief that Douglass is an object is destroyed. Right? I mean, obviously, if you're like, this person is an object, and that object kicks your butt, you can't maintain that belief that that's an object anymore, right? Because you felt the effects of that object. So his kind of belief is shattered. And where that belief is shattered, there's a space, at least, for a revelation for Coffee in existential terms, that in fact, he's making a free choice to see Douglas as an object. I'm choosing. It's not just that you are an object. I'm choosing to see you as an object. And now, because now I can see it differently, because now, my perspective of you has been changed by your, conquering me, fighting back and physically defeating me. That now I can see that I'm choosing to see you as an object and not just compelled by objective fact or reason, because obviously it's not even true, right? It can't be objective fact or reason. It's not even true that you're an object. So I must be choosing to make you into an object. And this revelation, seeing my free choice, or Coffey's free choice, to see Douglas as an object, this has the capacity, at least, to bring a revelation, according to Gordon, of his own existential freedom. Right? I am a human being making choices, not just an object myself, kind of being compelled to sort of treat you as a slave because you're a slave and I'm a master. This is just reality. Like, holy crap. I am choosing to see myself in a certain way, you in a certain way. I have the kind of, space of existential human freedom for the first time to see my own choices in the world. Okay. And then the last part here, this is not totally complete, but this is a phrase from the Angela Davis portion of that essay, and that was in the review, asking about what was the first phase of liberation, what the slave must reject, what does the slave grasp, who grasps the real significance of freedom. So let's just put this together, right? So the first phase of liberation must thus involve a rejection of the material conditions and ideological images contrived in the interest of the slaveholder class, right? So the first phase of liberation involves rejecting the material conditions and ideological images of slavery. The slave must reject his or her existence as a slave. That's the first phase of liberation, according to Angela Davis. And the slave who grasps the real significance of freedom understands that it does not ultimately entail the ability to choose death over life as a slave, but rather the ability to strive toward the abolition of the master-slave relationship. And that's why her essays sort of talk about the unfinished, project of liberation, that it's not just about freedom, even in an existential sense, or my freedom. It's about freedom that requires, even in this context, the abolition of the master-slave relationship. That hierarchical structure is what is required for understanding the real significance of freedom, striving toward that. Okay, so then there are a couple of questions from Du Bois. In the Souls of Black Folks, 1903, Du Bois says, the Negro is a sort of seventh son born with a veil in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelations of the other world. So this is his articulation of this notion of double consciousness, which he defines as, in the context particularly, obviously, the Souls of Black Folks. This is about his articulation of double consciousness for Black people in America, is having one's internal sense of self, and also having to view oneself externally through a negative white perspective. So it's the idea of, we all sort of look at the world. We sort of think of ourselves, I'm a good person, what do I want to do with my life? What do I see as important? That's like your internal kind of self-consciousness, self-worth, self-identity, all that stuff that's your own internal consciousness. People ask you, how are you doing? I got to think about it. How am I doing? That's something that comes from within, in this sense, right? But then there is the kind of, in the content framework of double consciousness, there is the way that you're seen. In the context of race, you're seen in a particular way. You are expected to be a certain way. You are, thought to be a certain way, however that is in racial context. For Native people, drunk and lazy, or whatever those kinds of stereotypes are based on how you're seen, externally. And that, is through race, through the color of your skin. You are determined as a certain kind of being. But this creates a double consciousness. It creates your own internal sense of who you are and your self-worth and your value, and then how you're seen, oftentimes negatively. Right? And then so this creates for Du Bois a kind of antagonism, that you have to constantly negotiate how you see yourself and how you're seen. And so there's an example of that in Richard Wright's 1945 Native Son. In this scene, this is talked about in the Mark Black essay as a description of double consciousness. So Bigger Thomas has an interaction with Mary Dalton and her boyfriend Jan on his first day as their chauffeur. Jan, the boyfriend, holds out his hand for Bigger to shake. Quote, Bigger's right hand gripped the steering wheel, and he wondered if he ought to shake hands with this white man. But then Jan says to Bigger, don't say sir to me. I'll call you Bigger and you call me Jan. That's the way it'll be between us. Bigger did not answer. He flushed warm with anger. What Richard Wright is trying to articulate, and there's lots of examples in this book and in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is obviously an articulation even of double consciousness just in the title, that there's this kind of way in which for Black people in these stories, you're invisible, right? You have your own sense of like, well, what does Bigger want to be called? What is going on? What's going on with you? How do you feel about this? What would you like us to call you? Those things don't even matter. They're not even there. There's not even a question of what he thinks, right? Because he is seen, and based on how he is seen by Jan and Mary, they tell him what will be the case. His own internal kind of, consciousness, his understanding of himself. How are you doing today? What would you like to be called? What's your perspective on this? Is not even seen as a possibility, right? And that sort of double consciousness, the kind of visibility matrix of double consciousness, because of the visibility of your skin and race and racism, you're transparent. Your consciousness is on your skin, literally. I know who you are. I know what's good for you. I know what you were thinking and what you're going to do. And I don't need to ask you and to talk to you, right? So that's what in this context creates the kind of anger, the frustration that throughout this novel Bigger is experiencing, because he has to understand how he's seen, right? He's constantly trying to navigate this world of how people see him and react to his physical appearance. But nobody even cares to ask him about how he's seeing the world and what he thinks. Those things are not even apparently, a part of reality at all. And so there was a question in some of the work in Module 5 and in some of the video discussions about Mos Def's song Hip Hop from the album Black on Both Sides, which even that album references double consciousness, right? And this visibility matrix. In particular, in one of the lines in that song, Mos Def says, "Invisible man got the whole world watching." And that's a part of I'm invisible. Everyone can see me, but I'm invisible because all they see is my skin, and that is the world that determines my reality, because transparently they know who I am, just as in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. But even the Black on Both Sides has that, right? Because he's saying, when you see, there's a me inside, right? And that is, I'm also trying to put that out to expose that. In a similar way, that's part of the discussion of positive Blackness. That's a part of the way that Du Bois tries to deal with this antagonism of double consciousness, where I have my own internal positive description of my Blackness in this sense for Mos Def, and an internal negative description, what Black calls one's sense of self, and the internal composed contempt, kind of negative association with Blackness, and my own positive association with who I am. Du Bois hopes to merge these two, which requires in his work, particularly later work that we talked about in the video and in the PowerPoints or the key, requires an external positive ascription of Blackness. And you see that in a lot of, not only in the Harlem Renaissance work of, from Du Bois and Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright, but in all kinds of stuff sort of continuing on, kind of notions of Black as beautiful and so on. A part of twist of turning that negative external ascription into something positive as a way to kind of help merge one's sort of inner sense of self-worth with an external sense of the affirmation of that self-worth. So that's the end of the discussion on Du Bois and the material that I wanted to share with you.